MPA Capstone Project Options Assessment. The purpose of the Options Assessment section of your capstone project is to explain which of your options should be recommended to your client, the reasons for your recommendation, and the factors that you considered in making your decision. In assessing your option, there are 5 basic assessment dimensions. The first is political feasibility, and typically political feasibility can be analyzed by looking at the stakeholders' positions, their consensus, their opposition. That the stakeholder analysis can be a key to assessing political feasibility of an option. The second is administrative feasibility. Is one option more complex to implement? Does one option require particular legal gymnastics that's not required in another option? The third is financial feasibility, involving the costs or savings associated with an option. The fourth is equity, or basic fairness. And the fifth is effectiveness. This is very important. Will the option actually work? In completing your options assessment, you should develop a table. The options should be specified across the top in the columns, and the dimensions of assessment should be specified in the rows going down the side. In this hypothetical scenario, a village is considering changing policy as to who is responsible for maintaining sidewalks. This simple analysis rates each option on the 5 basic dimensions and then summarizes the overall result of the assessment. For example, having the tenants maintain responsibility for the sidewalks is perceived to be more administratively feasible but less fair. So it has a high in administrative feasibility and a low in equity. A basic problem is that the table by itself does not explain how the ratings were developed. The memorandum would have to explain what low, medium, and high means in each case. The summary rating would also need an explanation. This explanation would be provided in paragraphs that would occur underneath the table in the memorandum. Here's an alternative way to do an options assessment. In this assessment, we're using a 10-point scale to assess the dimensions of each option. 10-point means that the option scores well on the dimension, and 0-point means that the option scores poorly. So in this analysis, taking into consideration the assessment of all the factors, having the village continue to be responsible for sidewalk maintenance remains the preferred option. Once again, it would be necessary for the policy analysis to explain the scoring in paragraphs that would appear underneath the table. Here's a third example that is doing options assessment using a weighted scale. In this approach, the number of points that are assigned for a particular row varies according to the level of importance of the criteria. So in this analysis, equity is considered less important than political feasibility or effectiveness. So in the analysis, then, for example, the village gets 30 points as an option for political feasibility, and the owner-landlord gets 15 points. In the analysis, then, we still find that the village is the preferred option, but the weights are slightly different because some factors received more points than other factors, indicating the importance of that factor in the decision making. Here is another option for an assessment table. In this approach, each option is assessed based on a brief rating and explanation. Rather than using numbers, we're using labels and sentences. But once again, it would be necessary for the policy analysis to explain the ratings and to expand upon the brief explanations in greater detail in some paragraphs underneath the table. Now let's consider each of the primary dimensions of assessment for our policy assessments. Let's start with political feasibility. The key question is whether your client can expect to have the necessary political support to implement the policy option. Consider the positions of the stakeholders. If you've identified key stakeholders and there's common support for a particular option among the stakeholders, it's probably politically feasible. But if essential stakeholders oppose an option, it's probably unfeasible. The second factor is administrative feasibility. The key question here is whether your client can implement the option. Who would the client rely on to implement the option? Are there legal and regulatory barriers? Is the option very complicated and difficult to implement? Can stakeholders opposed to the option make it even more difficult to implement? The third factor is financial feasibility. The key question here is whether the funding is available to implement the option. Does the option cost a lot to implement? Where will the funds come from? Does the option save money? If so, it is clearly financially feasible. Are stakeholders who support the option willing to support funding what the options may cost? The fourth factor is equity. The key question is whether the option is fair to all involved. Do any stakeholders consider the option to be unfair? Are there legal and regulatory requirements involving fairness and equity? Are there neighborhoods that would be adversely affected so that one community would be adversely affected by an option compared to another community? These are factors that are involved in assessing equity. The last factor, but possibly the most important, is effectiveness. The key question here is whether the option will accomplish what is expected to be accomplished. What is the option expected to accomplish? Will this help to address the problem that you identified at the start of your analysis? Do any stakeholders consider the option to be unworkable and impractical and ineffective? Is there evidence in the literature review that the option has worked in other settings or in experimental settings? The key question then is whether the option will work. In addition to the 5 basic dimensions that we've reviewed, you may add additional dimensions that are specific to your topic. Usually these dimensions are refinements to the basic dimensions. For example, stakeholder consensus might be identified specifically under political feasibility. Under administrative feasibility, you might have specific rows for labor contract constraints, legal constraints, environmental impact requirements. Under financial feasibility, you might have a row that deals with costs. You might have a row that deals with financial benefits and savings. You also might have a row that deals with investments that are necessary to achieve the savings. There might be an initial cost necessary to achieve down the road savings. With respect to equity, you might have a special row for possible adverse effects or a row for area effects, where one area would be affected differently than another. And under effectiveness, you might want to have separate rows for research-based evidence of success, practical experience in other jurisdictions. So you can set out in greater detail the factors that you consider in determining effectiveness or in any of the primary assessment dimensions. In presenting the recommendation, one or more options must be selected, and following your table, your memorandum should provide a narrative summary of the table explaining anything that was really not fully explained in the table, anything that needs to be clarified or deserves expansion. This is an illustrative table, an options assessment. In this case, the options are down the side and the criteria are across the top, so the table is flipped compared to the one that we did before, but it is an example of a table that a student did in which there were labels and brief verbal assessments of the options. The following is a more complex table that is introducing into the analysis more factors. This is actually a table about changing draft policy, the military draft policy. There are a variety of dimensions down the side, but there are 4 basic options that are characterized across the top. Notice that there is the assessment of options section begins with a table heading, and then there is a paragraph before the table that introduces the table and explains what the table is going to say, and then the table appears. In summary, the options assessment section explains which of your options you would recommend to your client, the reasons that you're making your recommendation, and the factors that you considered in making your recommendation. Thank you.